All right. So, Mary of Marion Isle, published in 1929, was one of the last works that Rider Haggard ever wrote. And it's a very strange novel that fits somewhat oddly within the Rider Haggard canon. Haggard, of course, is mostly known for his adventure fiction, particularly what were known as his African romances. Books involving daring British adventurers and set typically in the southern part of Africa and often involving fantasy elements. His total output included a number of historical novels set mostly in either medieval Europe or the ancient Near East, some non fictional prose, some science fiction fantasy works, some set in contemporary England, and, a few that are a little bit hard to classify. To 21st century readers, it's probably the African romances that are the most familiar. Sigmund Freud was very captivated by his novel She. Many of his novels were adapted as films during or shortly after his lifetime. King Solomon's Mines has been adapted as a film at least 3 times. As I learned, as recently as 2004, it was adapted again as a television miniseries. His most famous character, Alan Quatermain, was featured as a character in the comic book series The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and the 2003 film with the same name. And of course, his books, particularly She and King Solomon's Mines, occasionally make an appearance in college literature courses. So, what I'm getting at here, Haggard's work has had a good deal of staying power. Mary of Marion Isle does not, however, seem to be one of his more remembered works. And I'll get around to some reasons why, but I should say up front, this is probably the dead last work I would recommend someone who is completely new to Rider Haggard. And it's also not necessarily the one I would recommend to someone who maybe read King Solomon's Mines or maybe read She for a class and is trying to figure out what to read next by him. Yeah, it's it's interesting if you really want to know as much as possible about Haggard and what he wrote and what he was thinking about. But it's kind of for the completionists and anybody who's just really curious about it. If you are in that position, you've read a few of his works and are wondering where to go next. There are a lot of good options. Give The Ghost Kings a try. That one's really bizarre and really fantastic. Or go the conventional route and read Alan Quatermain if you haven't already. The thing about Mary of Marion Isle is that I think because the idea is so awesome, it's a little frustrating that it doesn't work better. Basically it's a shipwreck narrative where the shipwrecked character discovers a female who was shipwrecked a long time before him on the same island. And she's been living there, farming, fishing, subsisting for a very long time already. And they get together and hit it off. So it's kind of a cool plot line. And for what it's worth, that part of the novel, sort of the last third of it, is definitely the good part. I'll give a little summary just to give a sense of what kind of plot this novel has, because it's fairly complicated. So the main character is an Englishman named Andrew West, an orphan who at the time of the novel begins has just gone through his final examination to become a doctor. His commitment to radical socialist ideas tends to infuriate his uncle, Lord Atherton, who is some kind of hard alcohol tycoon, I guess. Unfortunately, Lord Atherton's son, Algernon, has very weak lungs, and he doesn't heed Andrew's advice that he would be healthier if he drank less and got more fresh air. And Andrew happens to be next in line after him to inherit. Andrew lives in London in the house of Ms. Joski, a plain, good-tempered, bustling, and talkative little cockney with a 9-year-old daughter, as she's described. Out of medical school, Andrew works up to 12 hours a day as an unpaid assistant to his hero, Dr. Watson, an idealistic man with an ascetic face and the look of a visionary in his eyes, whose beautiful daughter Rose he is also in love with. Blinded by his love for Rose, he brushes aside Ms. Joski's suspicious dislike of her and warnings about her character. Andrew stumbles on an amazing opportunity when he impressively saves a woman with a difficult surgery, and a man named Somerville Black makes him an offer to work for him in an arrangement by which Andrew would make £500 a year, become partner if he did well, and take over the practice when Black died. Somerville Black, said to be the richest man in the profession, is vulgar and overpowering and full of bad jokes. But Watson admires his brilliance as a diagnostician of diseases and ailments. Andrew's first impulse is to turn the job down, but he ultimately takes it up in the hopes that doing so would eventually make it possible for him to marry Rose. His job working for Black is essentially like a medical bottle washer. He does well enough, but he's dissatisfied because he isn't learning very much or doing particularly important work, and the job's just very, very boring. Black also has a daughter he doesn't get along with, a, quote, tall, elegant-looking woman of about 30 named Arabella, who, despite being many years older than Andrew, takes a strong romantic interest in him. Arabella complains of ill health and indigestion, even though Andrew insists there's nothing wrong with her. She also complains that she's stupid, uninteresting, and unhappy. Andrew uses the fact that Arabella seems willing to do anything she thinks might please him to her advantage in telling her that Dr. Watson is looking for a nurse, and it would be good for her to go and work for him. On arriving, Arabella finds that Dr. Watson's hospital is very poorly run, and realizes she might be more useful to him as a housekeeper than as a nurse, a suggestion which Dr. Watson is more than happy to oblige, considering that Rose has been absolutely no help at all. Rose and Arabella from the very first despise one another, but Arabella's work as the housekeeper wonderfully transforms both the hospital and herself. Somerville. What was I thinking? He one day receives a health-related visit from Lord Atherton and Algernon, during which he recommends Algernon cut back on his alcohol consumption and travel somewhere with a milder climate. Algernon agrees to go to Egypt, but only if his cousin Andrew comes with him, which Andrew is happy to do. Before they leave, he feels real sympathy for Lord Atherton for the first time and promises to do his best for Algernon while they're away. Algernon's health issues initially seem to improve, but when he hits it off with the daughter of a Manchester tradesman and the two of them get lost in a tomb tour together, he comes back with the chills and, having drunk a bottle of brandy, abruptly dies. It turns out that days before Algernon's death, Lord Atherton had written Andrew out of his will and left everything to his daughter Clara, a young woman described as being small in build and perfectly proportioned with crisp auburn hair. And she did a little bit of scheming for the inheritance. A lawyer thinks Andrew has grounds to contest the will, but he isn't interested in doing that. Nor is he interested in Clara's willingness to share some of the inheritance with him. His eyes fill with tears when he learns that Rose has married Solomon Black. I keep calling him Solomon, it's Somerville. Well, he was away because he was unhappy at home, and she likes nice things. Who would have guessed, right? Black, for his part, has heard that there's been some kind of romance going on between Rose and Andrew, but Rose has entirely denied it. However, it's her turn to burst into tears when she finds out that Andrew is now a lord, and she hence missed an opportunity to be married to a lord. Black, for his part, is surprised nobody ever told Rose that Andrew was next in line for a lordship. For the next 3 weeks, Andrew is so unhappy that he contemplates suicide. On learning that Arabella and Dr. Watson are now married, he departs for the northern estates he inherited so he can fish and get to know the tenantry. Clara decides she's interested in marrying, and since Andrew is the least disagreeable person she knows, she sets her sights on him. She begins reading up on socialism and attending socialist meetings and pretending to be enthusiastic about the cause, all while privately believing that the system they advocate for would destroy civilization in about 10 years. However, her act works on Andrew, and it's not long before they're engaged. The marriage between Andrew and Clara doesn't go well. While she encourages him to start attending the House of Lords, and during his short time there he makes an impressive speech that gets people talking about him, he's disappointed how quickly her pretended interest in his philanthropic projects disappears after their marriage. She also takes no interest in their child Janet, with whom Andrew becomes absolutely obsessed. Unfortunately, his beloved child dies at 5 years old when he has to leave her with Clara for a few days, and Clara, upon seeing the child fall ill, doesn't consult a doctor. After this newest blow to his happiness, Andrew continues to work as a scientist and is elected to a Royal Society fellowship. Clara's ambitions, however, lay elsewhere, and she obtains and eventually gets him to accept a governor generalship of Oceania by telling him that there are some interesting diseases there that he can study. The ship, however, on its way to Oceania hits a rough icy patch and sinks. Andrew ends up escaping the shipwreck on a boat and follows an albatross to an island that fortunately has a shack built by the last people who were there. After a few months on the island, Andrew is cured of any desire to be rescued, in spite of the loud, intense winds and the cold climate. He adopts one of the island's cats and names it Josky. And this is where he meets the title character, a beautiful, strong, wild woman named Mary, who's been living on the island since she was 6 years old, and she was shipwrecked there by an old man named Tom, whose skeleton she still keeps intact. Tom confessed to Mary before he died that he cannot remember who her parents were or why she was brought to the island, but Mary believes that the spirit of Tom still talks to her. So Mary and Andrew begin living together and quickly become mutually attached. While they do send off the albatross with a message around its neck that Lord Atherton survived the sinking of the Neptune and still lives, they immediately regret doing so because Andrew realizes he's perfectly happy and would rather not have his existence discovered. However, Andrew becomes more conflicted when he realizes the degree of his infatuation with Mary. Given that Clara may or may not have survived the sinking of the Neptune, which would make his love of Mary adulterous. To try to get out of this dilemma, he decides to abruptly leave her and go back to the shack where he lived in before he discovered her, back on the other side of the island. Unfortunately, he becomes very ill and only survives because Mary sets Josky the cat to find him, gone to the shack, and nursed him back to health. Now realizing he cannot live without her, they go back to the cave, resume living together, and have a kid. After about 5 years of Andrew living on the island, the albatross dies in Western Australia, is found by a man prospecting for minerals, and soon Andrew is the most talked about man in the world. The news arrives one day before Clara is about to be advantageously remarried, which makes her exactly as angry at the albatross as Andrew is. Mary has a dream where Tom tells her that something really bad is about to happen, but he won't say what. Clara and Andrew have a disagreement where Clara doesn't blame Andrew for seeing Mary, seeing as Mary is such a beautiful savage, but still it must end. Andrew disagrees and tells her he has no intention of returning to England. So Clara and the men who brought her stay for one more night. Mary and Andrew discuss the possibility of fleeing to the backwoods of Canada, if by some chance they're brought back to England by force. Andrew wakes up that night to a suicide note from Mary, who Clara had realized might be suicidal and stealthily sought to encourage. In a final twist, however, Mary sees Clara washed from the boat in the storm, and rather than going to kill herself, goes out unsuccessfully in an attempt to save Clara. Andrew arrives just in time to save Mary, but not in time to save Clara, and the novel ends with Andrew and Mary kissing on the beach, determined to live out the rest of their days on the island. So, yeah. You can probably guess based on that summary why this novel is not particularly well remembered, why it did not have the kind of staying power that some of his other novels have had, why college professors don't assign it, why its characters didn't become iconic cultural figures, and why nobody, to my knowledge, ever attempted to do a film adaptation of Marion Isle. The plot is kind of all over the place and kind of drags on, and most of the characters are pretty flat and uninteresting. Rose is just a pretty girl who likes money and jewelry. Claire is just kind of an ambitious and manipulative social climber who is so heartless that she's totally indifferent to the death of her own child and nonchalantly watches it die. Mary's just kind of this gorgeous woman who managed to avoid the corrupting influence of English society by getting stranded on an island when she was 6. Algernon's kind of an amusing character, but then again, the whole trip to Egypt seems mostly designed to get Andrew away from England so Rose can ditch him while he's gone. And you can kind of see that coming. Here's the thing. For starters, Haggard had the most success doing adventure fiction and fantasy. He definitely was not at his best when he was attempting to write more in the vein of, I guess, Trollopian realism, for lack of a better term. But even by that standard, if you compare this to his earlier novel, Beatrice, Beatrice is an adultery novel set in contemporary Wales. I think it was actually adopted as an Italian opera at one point. Haggard actually considered Beatrice one of his best works. I don't know how many readers today would go that far, but there's certainly things about it you can see how it works in ways that Marion Island doesn't. Even if it likewise features villains that are a little bit on the cartoonish side. Like Beatrice, the title character, is very intelligent, very conscientious, very independent-minded, and sometimes a just very, very conflicted character. And she has way more depth than any of the characters in Mary of Marion Isle. Plus the plot in Beatrice is a little more cohesive. So with all that said, what is it that's so interesting about Mary of Marion Isle? What are some things worth discussing here? Well, Rose and Arabella are each other's stepmothers. That's kind of weird. Because Arabella marries Rose's father and Rose marries Arabella's father. There's an interesting kind of generational disconnect throughout the novel. Dr. Watson and Rose do not have a very good relationship. He doesn't think very highly of his daughter. Arabelle and her father don't get along. Lord Attenborough at one point says, "My son hates me," referring to Algernon. So you've got 3 parents there that have explicitly unpleasant relationships with their children. Yet interesting with Mary and old Tom, her kind of surrogate father, it's the exact opposite. They're so close that she keeps his skeleton in the cave, and he literally speaks to her from the dead. It seems like one more dimension to this idea that life on Marion Isle, isolated from all human society, produces stronger, healthier family ties than this corrupting environment in contemporary England that seems to be driving a wedge between parents and their children. And speaking of old Tom, so this is another thing about Rider Haggard. Even his novels that aren't really about magic or fantasy always kind of flirt with the supernatural. And a lot of the time, So a lot of his novels, there will be like real magic in them, and there will be like fake magic, like trickery, and sometimes it's, I think, deliberately ambiguous which is which. But there's a lot of. It seems like most of his novels at some point or other can involve some form of precognitive dreaming. But in this case, 5 uneventful years on the island, and the night where Mary receives this message from Tom that trouble is on its way, and the next day is the day that Clara arrives. Haggard's definitely floating this idea that this is more than a coincidence. As he does so often, he's kind of going out of his way to suggest that his spirit really is talking to her. Arabella is kind of the one character in the book that stands out as likable and interesting, I thought. There's a quote here. During tea, Arabella contrived entirely to monopolize Andrew, discoursing to him of Egypt and begging him to write to her and tell her about its wonders. And so this line is kind of drawing a contrast between her and Rose, who's pretty indifferent to him and doesn't actually see him before he leaves for Egypt because she's trying on hats. But what it says about Arabella is interesting, too. She's actually fascinated by the idea that he gets to go to Egypt, and she wants to hear everything about it. There's a real point of social commentary with Arabella, and I appreciate it all the more because it's not quite as heavy-handed as social commentary sometimes is with Haggard. And there's definitely a point being made here about the negative effects of wealth, or particularly of idleness, of not having to work, and just the evils of having a society where a significant proportion of the population is exempt from labor. And Arabella is like a very good, kind of a very good representation of why it's terrible for those people in particular who are exempt from labor, that they're exempt from labor. We first see Arabella, she's pretty sad. She has pretty low self-esteem. She's always complaining about various ailments she supposedly has, most frequently indigestion. She's hitting on a guy who's a lot younger than her, and she's very snivelingly attaching herself to him. And Andrew knows that if she had something useful to do with her time, a lot of these problems would go away. And it works. It works immediately. Like, she gets there and she says, this place is kind of a mess. And she starts overseeing the hospital and she balances accounts. And, again, it has a great effect on the hospital and a great effect on her. It's also interesting that Arabella eventually becomes very interested in the political discussions and projects of Dr. Watson and his friends, whereas Rose is completely indifferent to it, and Clara sort of pretends to be interested in it briefly, to get Andrew to marry her. Arabella seems genuinely very invested in that stuff with them. So yeah, and maybe it's a good thing that Arabella plays a fairly small role in the novel, even though she's one of the only interesting characters, because you get the sense that if she was more of a presence, then the commentary Haggard is offering here would be a lot less subtle, which it wouldn't be as effective that way, I don't think. It's hard to talk about this novel without talking about the setting. After all, that is something that Haggard was always great at, drawing these really daunting, really picturesque, really beautiful settings. And the thing is, if Haggard just wanted to write a shipwreck narrative, any relatively uninhabited island would have been sufficient, but You note that he didn't choose a tropical location. Marion Isle. Well, there's penguins. There's seals. Um, the wind, the way he describes it, I think he says it's like a howling banshee. So this is a place that is very cold and has deafeningly loud winds. And they're fairly limited in terms of the kind of crops they can grow. And there's giant waves crashing to the shore, and there's storms pretty frequently. In fact, it's a storm the night that Clara comes that leads to her dying and almost kills Andrew and Mary. But that's what makes it all the more, incredible that this is the place where they're living, and yet they don't want to be rescued. They're happy there. They're thriving. And even before he met Mary, that was how he felt. So it's not just like, oh, it's so beautiful they have each other. It's like, no, even before that. Even before that, they were pretty happy there. And that kind of gets us to what makes this novel so fascinating to look at. As it was the second last novel that Haggard wrote and the last novel that takes place in England, or 2/3 of it take place in England at least. So it's really kind of Haggard's final glance at England and English society. It's his final depiction of the country before he dies. And it can be kind of informative in that sense of how he was looking at things. There's a trope that comes up fairly often in Haggard's African romances where his narrators express their admiration for the Zulus and their way of life and their character. And his admiration of the Zulus, it's always accompanied by comparing their site. It always involves comparing their society favorably to England. Their way of life is better. They're more honest. Along those lines. So Marion Isle is one of a small number of novels where a significant portion of the action takes place in England. So it's useful in that sense of a depiction of what it is he's criticizing when he criticizes England and when he says that the Zulus have, in so many respects, a better society. What is he criticizing when he is criticizing England? It's Rose Watson, it's Claire Attenborough, it's Dr. Somerville Black, it's Lord Attenborough and Algernon. And if the novel's painful to read because there's so little depth or complexity to the evils of these characters, well, maybe that's the point. Maybe Haggard really does want us to be as fed up with contemporary society as Andrew is. So yeah, the novel was posthumously published, so when the public was reading this novel, Haggard, like Andrew West, was no longer with them, and like Andrew, he wasn't coming back.